I wanted to just say a big thank you to C4 for giving us a platform here at the Global Landscapes Forum. And what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about the Little Book series. I think most of you may have remembered the Little Red Book, which we launched back in 2008 after the Bali COP, which Reds really got legs. And since then, I don't know why, just everybody seems to want another one every year. And people keep running up to me and saying, I want another one for our box set, which I have on the mantelpiece. Well, here is the latest one. And where's Louisa? Is it the 7th or the 8th? I can't remember. It's the 7th book. So the 7th little book. And this has been a little different because we have worked with a huge range of collaborative partners who have helped us do this. And I think the purpose is really to trying to demystify what we mean by a landscape and a landscape approach. And in that good old little book way, we've tried to keep it simple and then add some catalysts which might help us get to where we all want to go. I particularly just want to thank the partners who have worked with us for so long on this over the last year or so. The Worldwide Fund for Nature and Eco-Agriculture Partners, the Nature Conservancy, IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, and also GIZ, which is the German Development Organization, TNC for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, C4, GEF even, the Global Environment Facility, the World Agroforestry Center, Tropimboss International, UNEP, and the World Bank's Terra Africa project. Now, if between us we can't come up with an answer, then well, I don't think anybody can on what we mean by a landscape. And it's been a very fascinating collaboration. You can find everything in here about it. But what I'm going to do now is just introduce the speakers who are going to be taking us through various aspects of this book over the next 30 minutes or so. First of all, there's Peter Graham, who's leader of the World Wildlife Fund Forest and Climate Program. Peter's responsible for overseeing World Wildlife work on forest and climate issues. Sarah Shear is the founding president and CEO of Eco-Agriculture Partners. She's an agricultural and natural resource economist specializing in land management policy in tropical developing countries. Fitri, and I'm sure I'm going to get your name wrong, Fitri, again, but listen, Adriana, hang on, let me have another go at it. Adriantha, near enough, wasn't it? Okay, well, great to have you here, Fitri, in Indonesia. He's country director at IDH in Indonesia, long-standing experience and a PhD in sustainable landscapes management. And then Corina Walrap is advisor for GIZ and has been working for the last 2 years in the Kailash Sacred Landscape and Conservation and Development Initiative. Where is that? Nepal. In Nepal. Great, in Nepal and in India, 3 countries. So we've got a very interesting panel. And without more ado, I'm going to try and moderate the session and keep everyone to time. So I'm going to turn it over now. Who's this first speaker? Is that going to be you, Graham? It is. So Peter, over to you, Peter.
Well,
we need a microphone on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here on this distinguished panel. And it's no coincidence that we're here to launch this book at this time in Paris on the cusp of a new UN Comprehensive Climate Change Agreement. The international and domestic commitments to address climate change are made in the context of sustainable development. And reaching those sustainable development goals will depend on our ability to both learn from experience and take advantage of political will, new policies and tools, including international climate finance for reducing deforestation and forest degradation. Now, we know what the challenges are. As was explained, there's a vast group of people that have been involved in this project, and the experiences and challenges that were described in the book, or have been described, include, among the top ones, the leadership and sustained political will to do the right thing. That is a key challenge. Also achieving impact at scale, and moving from collaboration to integration of production and protection activities on the landscape. Now, of these 3 that I've selected, we have some good examples of solutions. So that's the good news. On political will, here in Paris, we've seen that in the submission of intended nationally determined contributions, if I use the technical term, to combat climate change under the new UN agreement includes many, many countries committing to action in the forest and land sector. Also, at the beginning of this past week, on Monday, 17 governments from both North and South committed to concrete action to reduce tropical deforestation and degradation. Among these in particular, there was a commitment of at least $5 billion over the next 5 years from Germany, Norway, and UK for such action. In addition, we saw further commitment from private sector, including from Chinese companies and associations, to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. The second problem is achieving impact at scale, and we look at landscapes as the minimum scale for which to effectively deal with the key issues of modern natural resource governance. Firstly, to maintain functioning biological systems, to address the economic realities, complexities, and demands, to address the scale of climate change mitigation adaptation needs, as well as looking at the actual scale of institutions and where political decisions are made. So, scattered projects, we've learned, are not necessarily sufficient to achieve the impacts that we need. Now, within a coherent national framework for climate change and sustainable development, it's critical that we apply planning at the jurisdictional and landscape level. This is the level where the economy meets the environment, where people live their lives, make their living, where the impact of land use decisions have immediate impact on people and their environment. While the international and national policies and regulations can provide clear direction and enabling conditions, jurisdictions and landscape level action is what our joint efforts here need to focus on. The implementation of holistic, integrated land use planning and landscape level action is today the main obstacle to success and is the approach that will help close the still too wide gap between commitments and real conservation. So, integrated landscape management offers a systematic approach to address the root causes of the complex problem. And the complexities are as real as we've realized in implementation of activities to achieve REDD+ objectives as the complexities of the international negotiations themselves. We've learned a lot from both. Looking at the broad landscape level or scale offers the opportunity to address a far greater composite of factors across sectors and stakeholders from the outset.
Peter, you've got a minute, less than a minute left.
I'm just about done, which should increase the probability of successful outcomes. So the message of this little Sustainable Landscapes book is just that. We have to think globally, act locally, together across our landscapes. And on behalf of all the people at WWF, including my good friend Paul Chatterton, I'd like to thank all the contributors for such a successful outcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. We'll have some more interventions, but I do want to take some questions from the floor, so I'm going to keep you tight to time. Off you go, Sarah.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to start my intervention by those of you who picked up a little book on your way in to say that there's a glossary on page 10. And I thought it might be useful for some of you. One of the things we've been, I think, arguing about over the last decade has been what is the definition of a landscape. And we put our heads together after much discussion and much consultation. And we are simply saying that a landscape is a socio-ecological system that consists of natural and/or human-modified ecosystems, and which is influenced by distinct sociological, historical, economic, and socio-cultural processes and activities. And by integrated landscape management, we mean, this is a little longer, a way of managing the landscape that involves collaboration among multiple stakeholders with the purpose of achieving sustainable landscapes. The governance structure, size and scope, and number and type of stakeholders involved, private sector, civil society, government, etc., can vary. The level of cooperation also varies, from simply information sharing and consultation to more formal models with shared decision-making and joint implementation. And I am proud to use those definitions because they were hard-won, okay? But I think when people are looking at this, who have not been involved in it, they say, it is really hard. Working across sectors, working across stakeholder groups, generates conflict. They have different mindsets, different values, and different priorities. Yet, in some of the most challenging landscapes around the world, these whole landscape partnerships are actually proliferating. A recent study, which is illustrated in the poster right below me and on page 52 of your little book, it represents an exercise that was done by the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature initiative, of which most of us are partners, that documented 365 integrated landscape management initiatives around the world in Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And there's one coming out for Europe that just wasn't ready to include in the book. And on average, these included 5 to 7 different sectors and 6 to 11 different stakeholder groups. And what we wanted to do with this little book was to draw from that broad experience to say, what are the core lessons that have been learned about implementing integrated landscape management? And we came up with 5 key elements. The first one, establish a multi-stakeholder platform. And the critical issues are, who do you bring in, how do you engage them, and how can they interact, and how can they be well facilitated? The second element, you need to generate a shared understanding. People do start with very different information and perspectives. How can they share their perspectives? How can they understand the spatial linkages between what farmers do in this place and what happens in forests somewhere else? A third aspect is to do collaborative planning, not separate planning and then try to mesh them, but to figure out where the intersections, how are you going to try to generate synergies between the groups, how are you going to avoid or reduce the kind of trade-offs. Fourthly, a lot of attention to effective implementation, good communication, finding early wins that the partners can do together, having very good leadership and regular kinds of get-togethers. And fifth, it's really important to monitor for both the learning for adaptive management and also for accountability. Now, one of the things that we all recognized is that achieving these landscape management efforts can be made easier or harder by some very important factors. And so those we call catalysts. One is around governance. How do you get public agencies to coordinate together across scales and sectors? How do you handle tenure issues? How do you enable public participation so all the voices are heard in these negotiations? Secondly, finance. How can we get rid of unhelpful subsidies? How do we promote the kind of investments in integrated investments? How do we get financing for that? How do we coordinate? How do we use new efforts for fiscal policy? And finally, the markets catalyst. How can we make it good business for all the partners to be involved in sustainable landscapes? And we look at a diversity of experience around payments for ecosystems, markets that will allow more diversification of products from the landscape, ecotourism, et cetera. So there's a lot of fun stuff in there. And I think if I have a minute to conclude.
Actually, you don't.
I don't. Okay. I was going to give them. I will point to you the final conclusion section in which we lay out 5 key actions for movement. And I think the number 1 there is to look at how the integrated landscape management approach can be used to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And many of the others flow from that. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thanks. Thanks very much. Fitri, would you be kind enough to make your remarks now, please?
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure for me to be here, representing not only Indonesia, but also IDH in general. I would like to start by saying that I think as those of you know IDH, we've been learning from our commodity initiatives throughout the supply chain that has to some extent improved not only the productivity, but also the experience, the practices of those sectors and concessions, but it's not sufficient. Why? Because we've learned that there are so many cross-sectoral challenges that we need to tackle at really larger level or at the landscape level. Just to name some key challenges, the legality of land of smallholders, pit or forest management at the large landscape level, water or hydrological system, because one concession can do a lot of things, but if the neighboring concession will not do anything about it, it will be disasters. Look at the fires that happened in Indonesia, for instance. Social dimension and social conflicts. And of course, improving productivity of smallholders, small farmers, because I think if you talk about one particular company, it cannot only this kind of company responsibility to take over or to take care of these smallholders, small farmers throughout the supply chain. So there's need to be a combinations of improving productivity, protection, restorations at a larger landscape. Then that is why I think IDH has realized, or we have realized that there's need to be something concrete, but also something ideological that we need to change at really high level, at a larger level, at landscape level. So we do think that the launching of this Little Sustainable Landscape book, it's a little, but it's large in many ways. It's huge. It's a good starting point, not only to discuss, but also to have this kind of idea to be grounded in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, and many other countries in Africa, and Asia, and Latin America. Because we see that not only companies, but also there's a need to get involvement of national government, subnational government, and also local government down to village level. This is really concrete in the context of changing the behavior, not only big players like companies, but also many other actors that use the land and also use the natural resources on the ground. And I think we have set up, or initially set up 7 to 9 landscape. It could be more now. I cannot trace back the history of IDH because I've just joined this year, but I think Ninke, for instance, the one that also contribute to this book, could explain more about that, and also some IDH people here, and my team in Indonesia, there are some few here. But for the context of Indonesia, we are trying to experience or to initiate at least 3 landscapes in 3 provinces in South Sumatra, West Kalimantan, and Aceh. There are a couple of, or more than a couple of important things that we reckon that needs to be addressed. First, of course, the issues of spatial planning. How then we can, initiate some discussions, debate concretely about reforming spatial planning, because that's one critical aspect in the context of Indonesia and the landscape. The Green Growth Plan, sectoral initiatives, but also ensuring that improving productivity will be done in the context of also retaining or maintaining or protecting the remaining ecosystem. And of course, co-financing or investment that Sarah has already mentioned. Investment is not only for particular commodities, farmers or whatever, but also in the context of landscape in general. What we call, for instance, de-risking facility for small players, because banks, for instance, are not willing to finance small players because it's too risky for them. And of course, financing for restoration and protections. Just to have a legal cost, if you take into account legal costs alone for protection and restoration in Indonesia is huge. One particular ecosystem restorations that has 150,000 hectares, you need to pay upfront around $6 to $8 million for 60 years. I mean, so you need to pay upfront. So you need to also address this kind of barriers to be able to have companies, communities, as well as government to get involved in this large landscape. I think that's our key point, and thanks so much for inviting us and also supporting this good endeavor. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Fitrian. That's great. And Karina, would you be kind enough to make your remarks?
Yeah, namaste, good afternoon. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm speaking on behalf of the Kailash team. It's the Kailash Sacred Landscape Conservation and Development Initiative. It is facilitated and coordinated by ECMOD and supported by GIZ on behalf of the German government as well as UK aid. ECMOD is the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in the Hindu Kush Himalaya range. And in the last years they have set up a 6 transboundary landscape program in the region, and the Kailash project is the one which is most advanced in the implementation so far. So what is the Kailash sacred landscape? The Mount Kailash is the most sacred mountain for the Buddhists and Hindus in Asia. And the Kailash sacred landscape encompasses of parts of Tibetan Autonomous Region in China, where the Kailash is located, as well as parts of India, as well as Nepal. So this area has very strong cultural and ecological linkages. But as well, there are a lot of impacts of drivers of change which are affecting that area. So due to climate change issues, we have lack of innovative livelihoods, over excessive use of natural resources. So many of these issues are transboundary on the landscape level. So these 3 countries, China, Nepal, and India, they realized that it needs a joint as well as a multidisciplinary approach to be able to conserve and to develop that very sacred landscape for that region. So yeah, so the question is, how did it work? So I'm speaking here for an implementation project. So I want to raise 2 points, and these are achievements as well as lessons learned from our project. So one, Sarah Shears, she has presented quite nicely. So at first you need common understanding, multi-sectoral platform, you need common understanding, etc. So that first part, it took us quite long to get started actually. We used a consultative and iterative process, but it was essential to be able to develop the main project documents, which is the regional cooperation framework as well as the conservation and development strategy. So even it took long, it was very necessary to have that process, first to have a real common understanding between these 3 countries, what we want to achieve in that area. The second is also to building up the trust between the different partners and stakeholders. And the third is also to encourage the ownership of the countries to take that project along. The second learning I want to stress on, it's obvious, but I think we sometimes forget how much efforts that take, is the point of communication, coordination and team building, especially in an area of in a transboundary project. It's essential to have a good teamwork at the end. Also it is presented in the book that we start first with the multi-stakeholder platform, then it moves on to the common understanding, then it moves on in the implementation process. In reality, of course, all these are interlinked with each other. So even if we start with a common understanding, things are changing over time. So it needs continuously, again, reviving these reviewing and reviving this common understanding. New stakeholders come along during the process of implementation. So even if we want to upscale a project from a pilot site up to a landscape level, it needs again common knowledge management, at least good communication, to be able to reach from a pilot site up to a landscape level. So there's need for communities to exchange, there's need for nations to exchange, to be able to link up from local, national up to a regional level.
Marina, thank you. I think we're going to have to end it there, unless
Okay.
you've got one final point you need to make.
Yeah, so some of these knowledge management products we have developed are quite unique, I would say. We are also there at the pavilion, and if you have further questions, yeah, please feel free to contact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karina. There's one point that hasn't really come up so much in this particular panel discussion, and that is the importance of landscapes in the context of these negotiations, which of course is climate change, because a huge amount of emissions are coming from tropical landscapes in particular, in a combination of tropical deforestation and agriculture. And the mitigation potential of landscapes is absolutely huge also, and often not recognized. And I'm not going to put a number on it, because then we'll all argue about the number. But it's very big, and we shouldn't forget that. And I'm just going to ask Fitri just to comment, because of course Indonesia has been much on everybody's lips of late, and your country has been suffering terribly from haze. I'm glad to hear that the haze has dispersed, but any comments on the relevance of that to our landscape discussion, just very briefly?
Indeed, Andrew. I would say that when it comes to addressing climate change or greenhouse gas emissions coming from the landscape, you need to get this kind of agreement among stakeholders or land use players inside that particular landscape. First and foremost, to agree what is the current problem and identify that, and of course find the right solutions and share the right solution. Because if there's no common interest to address the solution, it will be so much difficult. I mean, talking about fires, for instance, as one of the crucial problems coming from Indonesia, we know that it links to worse or bad peatland management, or bad water management of peatland, and conversion of forest or peatland to different purposes. So you need to have a government, for instance, to have this kind of visions that what sort of areas that should be developed, what sort of area that shouldn't be developed, as well as what sort of water management that needs to be put there in the context of peatland, as well as companies agree to that kind of standard, as well as communities, because you need to take care not only the context of conservation and protection, but also productivity of community, because the welfare of community is important.
All right, thank you. A classic case of getting the integrated approach right and how difficult that is. Now, I'm going to turn it over to the audience, to have a few questions. If you'd like to just identify who you are, who you represent, and no long statements, please. We haven't got time. Just short questions. So could I have a first question for anyone? I probably frightened you all into... Oh, there we go. One at the back there. Could you identify yourself, please? Okay, thank you very much. Another question? We'll take two more. One more, please. Any other questions? Okay, have a think. Anybody want to answer about soils? Yeah, Sarah.
I'm definitely, I'm certainly one of those people who agrees with the International Panel on Climate Change that soil is one of the key sources of degradation and emissions, with huge impacts on agriculture, and also is one of the greatest potentials to do large-scale mitigation with benefits for watersheds, for benefits for productivity. We have a number of case studies in the little book that talk about the potential benefits of soils, and it speaks to this critical issue of bringing the agricultural, forestry, water, rural development actors together. I would actually include cities. We also talk a little bit about the role that cities are starting to play in these landscape management. So I think that the soil piece has been sometimes hard to get traction because other actors don't see the importance of soils. And these integrated landscape management processes can help mutually educate folks about the sort of central role that soils play.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, sir. And another.
David Rizzo from Invra, France. What about the landscape approach in Europe and northern countries?
Okay, can I have another? You, sir, there was another question.
Michael from
Mike, go ahead, Mike.
In Mexico. Aren't you people very worried about the sustainability of these new levels of governance which you're creating? Integrated watershed management has been trying for 20 or 30 years. They have a gap between problem sheds and policy sheds. You're dealing with the problem shed. You're dealing with the landscape's perfect for dealing with a problem, but landscapes are not perfect for dealing with the territory, which is the governance and the actual implementation of things.
Okay, and one more just over here.
Maybe cheating a bit. The book is a big thick. Will there also be a summary coming out, and when will that become available?
And no, there's no summary. You have to read it all, and then we test you. Can the panel answer the question? Yes, please.
Sure. Thank you. Coming from northern country, Canada, and being a forester, I'll try and speak to your question. There are differences, obviously, in the political landscapes in Europe and in North America in terms of ownership and political decision-making at what scale that's made. So in terms of the relevance of this to northern countries, it certainly is relevant. It's just the scale at which you define the landscape on the ground might be different according to the political landscape, the decision-making landscape, and also the diversity of economic actors on that. So in Canada, for example, you would have provincial governments who have constitutional right to the management of their lands, which would be the appropriate landscape or jurisdictional scale.
Sarah, I think, was next, and then Fitri, and Corinne, if you wish to, just a quick responses, please.
This European study of 80 landscapes will be out quite soon through the Hercules project of Europe, so I encourage you to go to the Hercules, which is a European Union-based initiative, and find out more about the work that they're doing. I wanted, though, to address rather the one about, is this really a sustainable approach? No one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm kind of bored today, I'm going to start working on a landscape approach. It is hard work. People are moving toward it because the existing siloed sector system is not working to achieve their goals. There isn't a shortcut. There isn't a way except by promoting the collaboration with other actors who are influencing what you're doing. So it's a very pragmatic solution because people don't seek it out just to do it. And what's fascinating right now is you see a huge change in governance happening. Many of the landscape initiatives we work with are not formal government processes at all. and others are quite formal government processes. And there's even a few governments, I was just recently in southeastern Mexico, where the government agencies have a very systematic process underway to try to harmonize regulations across sectoral programs within government, and where you have this interest in community-based contributions to governance. So I think we're very much in the midst of a revolution of land use governance, and integrated landscape management is sort of one of the approaches that is emerging from this vast amount of innovation and experimentation.
Okay, Fitri?
Thank you. Just to respond to Michael, I would say practically you need to have combinations of ecosystem approaches that is quite large to cover the areas, but also subnational level that is also quite large to cover the jurisdictions. That's why in the context of Indonesia, things that we are now trying to develop or have been developing is with the governor. Because province, let's say the context of South Sumatra is the size of Portugal. So it's not necessarily an easy way to do. But this is as large as possible to combine both ecosystem approaches, social dimensions, as well as jurisdiction. And if the governor, for instance, committed to do something, it's not sufficient only even the government commitment to be put in place, but you need also to get private sector, because they are the key players to be associated with the landscape program. Otherwise, it will be challenging.
I just want to respond to Nike's challenge, actually, because the book, it would have been thicker were it not for one thing, that when it finally, you know, all this trouble that we put to get this thing right, and then when it goes to print, somebody pressed the button wrong and the typeface is too small. It would have been at least 13 pages longer, so I apologize that the typeface is too small. It will be fixed on the online version. It'll be much easier to read, but I'm afraid we've got 3,000 of them like this, so please take them away and then we get another print run done with the right typeface. Look, we've got time for one or two more questions. Anybody? Yes, please. Oh, Nike. Okay, Sarah, over to you. Just briefly, please, there's a question at the back.
Yes, I just, sorry. The little book is being translated into French. It is being translated into Bahasa. Indonesia, there is an opportunity, I believe, discussions to translate into other languages. There will be briefs that are being developed and pieces of this that will be more chewable. But we're hoping that all the partners, and of which there's a large number, as you saw from Andrew's presentation, will be using this both internally in facilitating engagement within their own organizations and working with national governments, particularly as they move forward, those who are interested in using integrated landscape management. Did I cover the points? I did also just, I'm sorry, I'm the only one of the authors who's up here on the podium, so I did just want to recognize Nika Stam as from the Sustainable Trade Initiative, recognize Lex Hovani from the Nature Conservancy, recognize Paul Chatterton from WWF, and particularly recognize Louisa Denia, who managed all the rest of us from Global Canopy Program.
Louisa, come on. Come on. Yeah, I was going to recognize Louisa, but here she is. She was on my team. She's the editor of the little books and has done an outstanding job with this, herding cats. You think it's easy to work with these people? It's incredibly difficult.
And my colleague Seth Seamus from Eco Agriculture Partners.
So, a big thank you. There's a lady there. Last question at the back, please. Anyone want to pick that? Corinne.
Yeah, I'm just speaking for the GLF Sacred Landscape. So to finance right now, of course, there is donor money, but since we are like pretty much linking the project to public schemes, and government is taking over many of these activities, so through that, I also hope that sustainability will be assured in our project. The second is private sector involvement. It was mentioned already several times here on the podium. These are, in my opinion, the two key points which makes the finance as well as the sustainability. Thank you.
Just
Peter?
just quickly.
Oh, Fitri, sorry.
We need to leverage finance coming from both public and private sources. Public, for instance, in the case of Indonesia, is like $200–300 million of CPO fund that can be, used to support smallholder farmers in the context of sustainability as well. Private sector, for instance, I heard that APP would launch a Plantada Foundation that would support restorations for their own plantation and also others. So I think if we can combine these kind of sources and guide the process, it will be excellent.
I wanted to take the opportunity. There is a huge amount of innovation in this space. We've definitely not got the answers, but there's a lot of experimentation and really interesting work going on. And I want to use this opportunity to actually do an advertisement for Landscapes for People, Food and Nature initiative event that's happening at 3:30 this afternoon, specifically on how do you finance integrated landscape investments. In what room? 252A. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Peter, I think you have the last word.
Okay, I'll make it very brief on the landscape finance. The finance landscape will need to be almost as complex as the landscape itself. And you'll see right now that there are a mix of financial streams being applied at the landscape level, and I think what you described. And also, I'll put a plug in for the little book on red finance that was published a year or two ago that has a few good examples of that.
Well, look, I think we have to wrap it up, I'm afraid. The plenary is going to be starting soon. I just wanted to end by thanking the contributors to this book, not only those who provided finance, and you can see them on the front of the book and inside it, but also the authors who've contributed so much time pro bono to actually help bring all this together. And I'm going to set you all a challenge, because this book goes online. Is it online already? Soon will be online. But the little book of forest finance, which you were referring to, had 35,000 downloads in just 2 months in the Bahasa version alone. So I want to set you a challenge. See if you can beat it with the little Sustainable Landscapes book in whatever language you can find it on, and let's have as many downloads as we can. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to everyone for producing the book.